I think that one of the things we did is we romanticized entrepreneurship. People are like, I want to run my own business so that I can, what is that word they use? So that I can have freedom.
Yeah,
no, you
freedom.
won't. No, you won't. People think when you start a business, you work less hours. What actually happens is you double your hours and you lose all of your leave days and all of your holidays and you take all of the risks. So to all the entrepreneurs watching this with the idea of freedom, when you start a business, it is the antithesis of that. The business is going to own you because businesses are like children. They're very jealous. They invested their own assets themselves in themselves. Say whatever you want about the Chinese. The Chinese invested their own assets in China. They didn't wait for somebody else to go, we're going to give you aid. Listen to this. The slave owners who owned slaves through the transatlantic slave trade, when slavery was ended, the British government paid out the slave owners. Do you know who the British government didn't pay? The slaves.
So, not to sound cheesy, but I'm going to lend the intro of, the Idea That Matter podcast. Hello, family.
Hey, that's patented. You're not allowed to do that. That's trademarked. That's trademarked. but now that you've mentioned it, we're releasing a batch of merch, hoodies and coffee mugs that say "Hello, family." I'm like so excited. That's gonna be cool.
I need all of the different versions of that. All of the different versions of that. No, for everyone that is taking this journey with us. Again, like we said in our first episode, this is just for us. It's a conversation that you're eavesdropping in. Because whether or not you're here, we'll be having this conversation. So do us a favor. Share this around, bring the community along, and let's have a wonderful chat on what we like to call the African Forward podcast. So if you ever get to listen to episode 1, we name it at the What Next. And now we're here with African Forward. So you tell us which one sticks. Vusi, my co-host, how are you doing?
Yeah, man, I'm good. Listen, it's been a very busy week. I am at the office Thursday, 1st of August. It's 8 p.m. my time. And for the people watching this, if you're an entrepreneur, you only do the work when the team is not at the office. That's actually the story for most entrepreneurs, right? Because when your people are around you, they're looking for direction and leadership and they're asking questions, et cetera, et cetera. So you actually really only get to do your work when it's quiet time. And so for me, evenings are quiet time. I left the office at 2 a.m. yesterday, true story. And I got home, and my youngest, because they're on school holiday, and my youngest, he was sitting in my study, my home office, watching stuff on my TV. And as I came home, he's like, "Where have you been? 2 in the morning. Like, where have you been?" And in my mind, I had this moment where I was laughing because I was like, my mother used to do that. You'd go out to a party and my mom would be like, "You better make sure midnight strikes. You better be home." Black mothers, right? Black mothers.
I know.
So anyways, but I finished late yesterday because we were busy with some transactions and we've given ourselves over the past 2 weeks. We had 3 term sheets that we needed to get out. So I've been working on those term sheets.
But isn't it the case that, for those people who work 9 to 5, they think when you become an entrepreneur, I don't even want to finish that.
I hear that all the time. People are like, I want to run my own business so that I can, what is that word they use? I want to run my own business so that there's a word for it. There's like, so that I can have freedom.
Yeah,
no, you
freedom.
won't. No, you won't. No, you won't. No, you won't. No, you won't. I was a friend of mine invited me to a podcast today, actually. And I don't do a lot of interviews. In fact, my team will tell you, I'll do like max 3 in a year because I've been very intentional about reducing my share of voice, but increasing my volume of work. Right. Which I think is a good discipline for all of us in this world we're living in, where a lot of people have a lot of things to say. But anyway, this particular friend of mine, he's a very great guy, and he's had me on his radio show before. He's got a massive radio show, and so he's like, "You've got to do this. You've got to." And anyway, so eventually today I did the podcast, and he was interviewing me and the corporate sponsor and partner in this podcast, and we were talking about search funds because they've launched one, and we're having this conversation and discussion. And Anthony, who was the other guy on the podcast, who said, people think when you start a business, you work less hours. What actually happens is you double your hours and you lose all of your leave days and all of your holidays and you take all of the risks. So to all the entrepreneurs watching this with the idea of freedom, when you start a business, it is the antithesis of that. The business is going to own you because businesses are like children. They're very jealous. And the business is going to require you to be, really hands-on.
No, I absolutely agree. For me, I almost often think to myself, like, where in the world are some of these like misconceptions coming from? Because when you think about it, like, how do you think running a whole business gives you freedom? Like, how do you think, like, is it a social media thing? Is it that people maybe just oblivious of the fact that this is like life, and this is life.
I
It's
mean,
the 2
I
a.m.
don't think
morning.
you're wrong. I don't think you're wrong. I think that one of the things we did is we romanticized entrepreneurship. And the truth is, I want to be clear, right? It's not like it's all doom and gloom. You have the freedom to shape your own destiny,
Yep.
but then you have the responsibility to shape it. And so, I get to the office. My team will tell you, I don't take meetings until 11 in the morning, and I typically don't take meetings after 4 in the afternoon. So I kind of squeeze my meetings into between 11 and 4. I don't do meetings on Mondays, and I don't do meetings on Fridays. Those are my standard rules. So any meetings that take place Tuesday to Thursday between 11 and 4. But I start my days fairly early from my home office, and then I work from the home office, and then I head out to the gym, and then after the gym, I head into the office. So by the time I come into the office for my meetings at circa 11, I've already done maybe 2 hours or 3 hours worth of work from the home office, and then et cetera, et cetera. So I say that only to say you can shape your life, right, when you are an entrepreneur. But to be clear, you're also taking all of the risk. And depending on what your cap table looks like, depending on what you are either the last stop or you're part of the last stop in terms of the responsibility of running that business. So it ain't easy, and I think that's a lot of what we need to try to reframe as a perception through this podcast, letting African entrepreneurs know what it really takes. I did this. Sorry, I don't want to monopolize our conversation, but I did this like interview many years ago, and the interviewer was asking me something, and I said to her, if you are in Africa today building a business, you are in the poorest continent in the world, not by resources but by GDP. You're in the poorest continent in the world. Of course, exclude Australia, which itself is actually a continent, but treat Australia like a country. I said to them, you're in the poorest continent in the world with the least developed industries in the world, with the fastest growing population of the world, and what will be the world's largest youth demographic by the year 2035. Now, if you're in the United States, to build a company in the United States, right, you have all of these things that work for you. You're in the world's largest economy. You have the world's largest capital markets. You have the world's deepest liquidity. You have all of this stuff. Yet it still took 30 years for Michael to build Dell. It still took at least 20 years for Bill Gates and Ballmer to build Microsoft. So if it takes them that long in the US, how long do you think it's going to take you and I here? And I think that's a big part of the perception we need to reshape, right? We love the story of who Aliko Dangote has become, but somebody sent me an image of Aliko Dangote's plaque opening one of his factories in 1986, and they sent me this thing, and they were like, this guy was opening factories in 1986. I was born in 85. And to many people watching this, Aliko Dangote probably didn't come into a lot of, certainly to me, he didn't really come into my consciousness until, kind of the 2010s, thereabout, when we all started knowing who he was. But by then, he'd been at it for a couple of decades. And so the point I'm making is it takes long. There is no shortcut to any place worth going. It just takes as long as it takes. Is that your experience with building ventures?
Let me share a story. This is the first time you're hearing it, right? So I think you and I have actually had this conversation before. The first time I heard VT was a friend of mine who have attended a Zambia TEDx program. The big lie of that is all. And then he left the program, and he rang me up, and he was like, there's a guy, man. There's a guy. It's like, it was like, there's a guy, man. There's a guy. He just broke every limitation that I have in my head. You have to go find this guy. I was like, who is this guy? Says his name is Vusi. And so I started looking on about like who's Vusi and stuff like that. So by the time I graduated university and then moved to several years later, when I moved to the Middle East, I met another friend of mine who loves your podcast. Like, he sleeps and wake up on ideas that matters. And this is the funny,
incredible.
True story. So my friend Mustafa will tell me that, listen, if you get to meet Vusi one day before me, just know that I will take it personal with you. So I remember I remember we were like in Dubai, and then you did that. One of the podcasts you actually did in Ideas That Matter is talking about limiting beliefs. Yeah, there's a
Yeah,
title of the podcast, and so it happened
yeah,
that he has listened to the podcast, and I listened to the podcast, and I said to him, I am going to work with this with Vusi someday. Newsflash: when we released the short flyer that I'm working with Vusi, he called me up and it was like, how can you stay so long with that dream of working with this guy that you and I have been arguing about? This is to say that this is perhaps 7 years later. Like this is not yesterday. This is like long hard time.
yeah,
The most successful things that I have done took me anywhere between 3 to 4 years to actually get it fully formalized and actually push it into the market. And this is another thing why this is a question for you, right? So today, hands down, your if not, I think there's not even debatable. You're Africa's leading voices. When you go on the stage, everybody knows VT. I think you're the most traveled, most respected African voice, not politicians, African business voice that is actually traveling across the world. You're not an African voice, by the way. It's just because you're from South Africa. But then people go on YouTube, they go on Instagram, and then they think that you got there within 2 years because social media helped you blow up, right?
exactly.
Like, what do you probably have met with some of these people. I mean, I have been in your presence when one person actually asked a very funny question. You didn't hear the question, but the person asked the question on how can I be so big? Like, how much should I charge as the speaker? They really don't understand like the amount of work and
That
research
it
that
takes.
actually goes into that. But
So,
also,
yeah,
let me
carry
continue.
on. No, no,
Also,
no,
another,
carry on,
another,
carry on.
another thing that I've actually sat down with some friends of mine one day, and it was actually immediately after one of our conversation, and then like we were
Right.
chatting, and then someone was like, I so admire Vusi, like he's built a global brand, and then he speaks across the world and everything. And then I asked him, I said, but do you know his business though? Like, do you know his business? Because these are
Yeah,
two different things, right? And
100%.
I have been privileged to know the business,
The
but a lot
business.
of people,
Yeah,
a lot of people just think it's Vusi traveling around the world and speaking on stages.
I should tell you, like, that's a double-edged sword, right? Because first, the fact that I lead with what I do, but I don't lead with where I do what I do.
Yes.
And I'm a believer, and I prayed over it. And one of the things I heard God kind of put into my heart was that if I made the things I've built become my identity, then people will think that that is my identity. And I just want to say to anybody out there, you are sufficient and you are good enough, whatever you're doing, whatever you're working on, whatever stage that it is at. So, a big part of the reason the stuff that I do, the businesses I'm in, the things that I'm invested in, the things that I'm building, and some of the things that we own that we're building operationally, that. But the truth is, you're maybe 1 in 10 people in the world that actually knows that stuff. A lot of people, if you go online and search Vusi Thembekwayo, there are three terms that Google says come up as the most searched. The first is Vusi Thembekwayo net worth.
Net worth.
The
Yes.
second is I saw that and I was like, all right. The second one is Vusi Thembekwayo businesses, and then the third one is Vusi Thembekwayo. I think like Vusi Thembekwayo wife or Vusi Thembekwayo partner or something like this. But I mentioned this because I think it's important for entrepreneurs to learn this very important lesson. We live in this era today where when you are a public success, people feel entitled to your private life. And, you know,
Yes.
I tell somebody once asked me this on Twitter. They were like, hey, why don't we know so and so? They're like, why don't we know your wife? I said, because they are my wife, not our wife. Why do you need to know them? What's it got to do with you, right? And I think it's really, really important for entrepreneurs watching this to realize what I'm about to say. You don't owe the public an explanation of your private life. My
Yep.
biggest advice to you, in fact, would be keep it about the thing you're doing, not about the person you are. And so,
Yep.
and it's completely antithetical, right? So like you see entrepreneurs now, they get successful and they raise a little bit of capital, then you're showing you in this house and in this car and in that place. Don't do that stuff because business is a mirror of life, and life has seasons. And if you invite people into your life when it's spring, they're going to be there when it's winter. And every single one of us will go through a winter. You're a human being on earth. You're not going to be spared from it. And so I would say, you just got to be very careful about that stuff, man. I'm lucky in the sense that, I was saying this to my youngest. I would like to think I was famous before Facebook. I was I was on the number one um, variety show called Mojo in South Africa back when we still had, I think it was like SABC One Simunye or something, 2003, 2004. So I was literally streamed and broadcast to all the television sets of the number one variety show in the number one TV channel in all of South Africa, and 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 became recognizable. And 2 years before that, I was competing at world championship level public speaking and being plastered all over the papers. So I've been in the public eye for long enough that being recognized publicly, actually for me, as you know, because you've seen me, you and I will be sitting somewhere at like we'll be going for like lunch in like London or something, and I'm like, where can we find the quietest spot where no one is going to find us and no one is going to say, hey, can I come and get a picture or
But they
have a
did find you
conversation?
by now. They did find you.
They still find us. They do. They do. On some of the things I think for us to talk about in this, and just to position the conversation for the people watching this, the work that you do is a lot around venture building and working with startup founders who are building ventures.
Yeah.
That's an industry that I come from because I've worked on the capital side of venture. Today, we operate as a much more mature vehicle. We're now permanent capital, not so much in the venture space, albeit we still have some businesses that we own in that space, etc. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I think it's really, really important, you and I are having this conversation about Thembekwayo Moya's book, Dead Aid, where she talks about how Africa needs,
Yep.
aid, or rather Africa needs trade and not aid.
Another
And one
eight.
of the
Yep.
statements she makes in this book is that actually the problem with aid is that it's created its own parallel economy that's distorting the real economics of
Yep.
Africa. And shout out to Startup Soko, by the way. For any of you out there in Kenya, you've got to follow a podcast called Startup Soko. It's like it's two interviewers and they bring somebody in and they have a conversation. There's a young lady there, I forget her name, but she made this point as well on an episode that they released 2 weeks ago. And the point is, when you bring aid capital into Africa with good intent, don't get me wrong, with good intent, but often what happens is there is already an operator in that space who's running a small business that is profitable. And
Uh-huh.
then you say, well, we're going to do this aid stuff and we're going to build ventures. And then you bring in a startup founder who can run a business that not only is it not profitable, but often doesn't even generate revenues. And all they have to deliver to you is an impact score. They've got to show you they've employed this many women, this many young people, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens in the interim is they distort the economics of the business that actually is making money, which is often run by somebody who's been in it for 10 years, 20 years. It hasn't scaled because it doesn't have the balance sheet and the infrastructure to scale, but it's adding economic value into that system. And then it distorts it and places that capital in the aid environment. And then an orange guy takes over as president, walks into a White House somewhere in the world, and he says, that's it, no more aid. And suddenly all these aid businesses are like struggling, right? So what I wanted to get a sense from you is when you went through, reading Thembekwayo Moya's Dead Aid, what was your thought on it? And secondly, where do you land on this whole like aid and trade for Africa and aid agencies? And then we might even talk a bit about these donor agencies and all the rest of it. What's your thesis on this?
So firstly, when I read that, one thing that was very surprising for me is the traditional, the actual part where aid actually comes from. So aid was not
Sure.
supposed to create a system of dependency, which is what we are um, experiencing today in the continent, right? It was meant to create a system to complement work that was ongoing. So, by the way, for those of you who are listening to this conversation, aid did not start in Africa, just to be clear, right? Aid starts in Europe, right? The whole
Exactly.
concept of aid, supporting systems, supporting infrastructure, supporting economies grow, started in Europe, and it actually worked. So now, again, this is the same. I think we've talked about this before, not to digress, but we've talked about not copying, not to avoid the idea of copying and pasting things that have worked in the West directly as it is, verbatim almost, apply to our context. Completely different. And I think what happened is that same structure was then, uplifted in Europe and then taken down to Africa. And this is what starts to happen. Dependency nature starts. It was easier for even our politicians to go in for aid because, again, they just have to focus on impact matrices. They just have to focus on some, I don't know, one KPI that doesn't even affect the low level guy, because at the end of
Yeah.
the day, they want more money. So they focus most of their attention on that, forgetting about the entire part of trade, which actually is what creates the independence that we actually need. And when you translate
Exactly.
that into small venture, this is why we see entrepreneurs today going from grants. Well, one of my friends called them entrepreneurs, going from grants to grants.
That's so good. That's good.
Like, you go from grants to grant to grant, but you never scale. And the reason for that is because you're becoming over reliant on grants, that you forget that it actually takes to actually build a seasoned business. And
Amen.
that's the problem. And where I stand is, and again, I think you and I have had this conversation. Whenever in our entire human history, VT, the entire human history, the people that have made the most names are the people who were at the point of death, meaning that death in economics, death in, physical death, but they were in a position wherein life was threatening them. So they have to think a way to actually go outside of that. If you look at what happened to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the work that they did, they were in a position wherein it was the only option was to actually stand up and then push forward. If you look at
Exactly.
economies in itself, if we look at what happened to Gaddafi, it was when when doing sanction that Libya actually secure economic growth. If you look at Russia economy become one of the largest economy by
It's
trade volume.
exploded
Exactly. During the whole
during
sanction
the
and
sanction
everything.
time.
Because you're now forced to actually look within to actually trade because aid is not coming in anymore. So if that's the perspective that we have, then don't you think when a certain president got into office and then say no more aid, don't you think it's actually for our own good and not necessarily a bad thing? Others were able to replicate this at the position of survival, were able to then build systems that allow them to freely trade. What is stopping us? And that's where I am in the whole A to V trade conversation. Because I think we have become inherently lazy, that all we focus on is impact metrics and not result on economics, or that actually gives us independence.
Shout out to Uncle PK, as I call him, but shout out to, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, who say whatever you will about how you feel about, his approach to leadership. But he's probably one of the few presidents in the continent who got this memo really, really quickly. And so, full disclosure, I worked with the KFC in Rwanda to raise a fintech fund, and I really got to understand what was the vision behind Kigali International Finance Center and how the Rwandese, but in particular under the leadership of the President Paul Kagame, have been thinking about how do they position the small nation of, I think it's like 12 million people that you can probably drive through in like 2 hours. Um,
Yes.
a lot of people are not aware. Like, you can literally drive from Kampala to Kigali, like they're just right there, right next to each other, right? But he started thinking about how do I take this nation and turn it into like the Singapore of Africa. And to do that, he would have been competing with Morocco, who had a similar vision. Shout out to the good people at the Morocco International Financial Center. We did some work with them years ago. They were clients of mine on our consulting business, probably well into like 10 years ago. And I remember vividly when they were opening the Morocco International Center, myself and Uncle Mo Ibrahim were invited there to come and speak. And then, of course, at the time he had just taken over as president of France, Emmanuel Macron was coming in. And so got to watch the Moroccans think about how do they build a financial infrastructure in Morocco that can rival that of South Africa. So in my lifetime, I've seen Morocco do this. I've seen Rwanda on the throes of doing it. And at the same time, I've seen Mauritius do it. Because Mauritius today, in fact, let me not get into that because that's confidential information. But the point is, Mauritius today is like the domicile of most of the venture capital private equity activity taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. And in my lifetime, I've seen the Seychelles do it. So I've seen Morocco do it, Seychelles do it, Mauritius do it, and very closely now the good people of Rwanda, kind of make a go at it as well. And from a South African perspective, what I begin to realize is that the game is changing. And it used to be 30 years ago, if you wanted to invest in fintech or in financial services in Africa, you brought your capital into the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the largest stock exchange in the continent, and you bought, a Stanbic, or you would a Standard Bank, or you bought an Absa, which then owned Barclays, or would later own Barclays. And through these, you owned you owned banking in Africa. If you wanted to own 20 years ago, 10 years ago, if you wanted to own telecoms in Africa, you bought MTN. And through MTN, you went to the rest of Africa. And I think what the rest of the continent is realizing is, one, they're not going to let South Africa sit at the throne unimpeded. They're going to challenge that. And I think they're very intentional about how do they challenge that. But the second thing a number of these economies are realizing is there is no savior coming to save us. That the most reliable way for them to build economies that create value is to build economies that create value, not economies that are reliant on aid. And I am fascinated by African leaders, governments, presidents, and policymakers who literally factor into their treasury departments and into their budgets aid that's got to come in from other countries. Like it's the craziest mindset to me that part of your household budget is how much charity you've got to get from your former colonizers. It's a wild idea. And I don't want to understand why it happens. But secondly, I don't understand why Africans themselves allow their leaders to get away with it.
I mean, so this brought me to an article that I wrote a couple of weeks ago, and in that article, I made the argument that it is only Africans today that we blame most of our problems to not only our politicians, but then to Europeans and colonizers, but then we in turn go back to them and ask them for the solution to come solve these problems for us, right? Because at the end of the day, what do you think happens? It means that whatever solution that they're going to profile, quote unquote, is going to be a solution that continuously links that dependency back to them. It's not about independence for you. It's about influence for them. It's about you continuously and consistently understanding that without them, you're nothing, pretty much, right? And again, this is what
And sorry, just to jump in there and to add the caveat and the disclaimer to your statement, which is to anybody listening to this, please separate reparations from aid, right? These are very different conversations.
Different things,
reparations is about a historical injustice from which the present peoples of those nations continue to suffer an economic disadvantage. That's a separate conversation to whether or not we should be taking in aid. Because if it is reparations, then it is a calculated amount. Somebody will be watching this going, why do Africans need reparations in the first place? Listen, let me tell you. I was in Cambridge a few months ago. I was invited by the Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. They have a business association, Africa Business Forum. They invited me over there to come and give a keynote. And whilst I was there, because as you know, you've seen me do this, my favorite thing to do anywhere in the world that I travel, first is I get fast cars from that part of the world and I drive them really fast anywhere where it's legally allowable. And then secondly is I visit museums. And the reason I love going to museums is because I'm a history student. I love the study of history. So when I was in Cambridge, I happened upon a museum. The name escapes me now, Fitzwilliam Museum. And they were doing an exhibition on Africa at the time. And anybody out there who travels into the UK, you ever find yourself in Cambridge, go to the Fitzwilliam Museum. It is an incredible experience and it's an unbelievable read of history. Like you learn that the Persian civilization predates Jesus by like 2,000 years. So this area of the world called Iran, where the Persians are, literally was there 3,000 years, 4,000 years before Jesus even walked the earth, which is now the past 2,000 years of our kind of global history. But I go to the Africa part of the museum and they were showing that the British government pay reparations to slave owners to the tune of £20 million. Listen to this. The slave owners who owned slaves through the transatlantic slave trade, when slavery was ended, the British government paid out the slave owners. Do you know who the British government didn't pay? The slaves. Or the nations from which those slaves came. Right. So the minute I hear people go, you got to leave reparations of past, I go, well, time out. Double entry accounting is a very important concept. If there is a debit for something, there must be a credit for something. In the old school balance sheet, assets equals owner's equity plus liability. What happens on the left, for those of you who did mathematics, must happen on the right. So if you paid money to the people who were the enslavers, surely there's some money that should be paid to the people who were the enslaved. So I just want to say we're separating the conversation of reparations from the conversation about aid.
I mean, something else that I want to mention in that is also we're not necessarily saying aid is evil. We're saying the over reliance on aid is what our personal challenges, because we should be actually striving to trade more than becoming an economy that is very over reliant to actually aid. We're not saying aid is bad. Remember, where aid comes from historically, it actually worked because these people were able to actually leverage that to build and then be able to trade. But when it comes to Africa, for some reason, man, like everything that is exported from Europe, when it comes to Africa, it's like we go to the extreme. So we're not really saying it is bad. No, that's not the argument here. The argument here is the over reliance of aid, especially across sub-Saharan nations, is going to continuously be the problem that Africans actually have to solve. And remember, it's not only about politics, not about how governments run. It's about what we just mentioned. It's about even the entrepreneurs who are overly reliant on grants, applying from one grant
Yeah,
to the other,
man.
to the
Yeah,
other,
to the
to the
next
other.
grant, to the next grant. Yeah,
And and,
yeah,
and and you can always make the argument. I see the argument. They can always make the argument, but there is no access to capital. Yes, and so
yeah,
you
yeah.
go into the business to actually solve real problem for real people. And if you're actually solving real problem for real people, those people will actually pay for that problem for that
Sure,
solution, right? And so
sure.
your grant should be enough for you to be able to actually continuously build a system that actually support these people that you're trying to solve to support, right? So going
You
from
know,
grants to grant in itself,
let me. So you've introduced a separate discussion, and let's take that segue now. You just said, a lot of entrepreneurs rightly say, but there's no access to capital. And listen, I get it. Anybody who's ever put together a pitch deck and gone to raise capital, I say to entrepreneurs all the time, if you think raising money for your business is difficult, try raising money for your business whose business is going to be investing in businesses. Try that, right? Because when you're raising money for your business, really all you've got to do is you've got to convince people that you've got a unique advantage at something that nobody else can do and the way you can do it, and you can create value disproportionate to the risk that they take, this thing called the risk adjusted return. But the minute you're saying, I'm going to raise money to invest in businesses, what you're saying is I have a unique way to find businesses that have a unique way to then go into the market. So you've now added an additional layer, and that changes the conversation. And this is what I do for a game, so I can tell you that that's not easy. But on this access to capital conversation, I struggled with this conversation, CD. Let me tell you why. The largest pension fund in Uganda is the NSSF. Great institution, good people. I've worked with them in the past. And to their credit, they have started diversifying their portfolio. They've started going into, real economy, real estate, et cetera, et cetera. But go and look at the pool of the NSSF, and then have a look at how much of that pool in the NSSF is directed at venture capital as an asset class in Uganda. In Uganda, right? So let me park it as a caveat. Let me criticize. Let me come to my own home country. Look at South Africa. We have the PIC, which is a pension fund, public investment corporation, a pension fund. Many years ago, there were clients of mine, and they are the largest pension fund in all of Africa. Couple of trillion rand, I think, in assets under management. They're massive, right? But and then go and have a look. So that's the PIC. And then in South Africa, we've got the PIC, we've got the Government Employees Pension Fund, you've got, let me think of another pension fund, the Eskom Provident and Pension Fund, EPPF, and a couple of these really, really large pension funds. Go and have a look at the portfolio construction of those pension funds, and then go and have a look at how much of the portfolio construction of those pension funds is not in the classical listed assets, bonds, and those kind of financial instruments, versus how much of it is sitting in the alternative asset space, and in the alternative asset space, how much of it is allocated into private equity and then venture capital. You'd be shocked to learn that often it's less than like 1% in many of the institutions that I've mentioned. And to be clear, I'm not pointing fingers at these institutions. It's actually an Africa-wide problem, right? Go and have a look go to Guinea, Conakry, before you go to Guinea-Bissau. Or go to, what's the other one? Go to Tanzania, you'll find a similar thing. Go to Zambia, you'll find a similar thing. These large pension funds, often that care for the pension assets that are for the workers of those countries, who then take those pension assets from the workers of those countries and invest them in financial instruments. Not bad, they're supposed to do that. It's the basis of portfolio construction. It's how do I get a risk-adjusted return? And there's a long conversation to be had about whether or not the venture capital asset class has proven itself to be a net positive for portfolio construction from a portfolio manager's perspective. That's a separate conversation. Just go and have a look at how much of that money they are planting in the real economy. Then what you realize is this, which was the point I want to make. Africa doesn't have a capital problem. We have the capital. We have the capital. And I know there'll be entrepreneurs watching this going, what is he talking about? Believe me, just in your own country right now, go on Gemini, go on Claude, go on ChatGPT, go on whichever AI that you use and say to them, and type in the following prompt. Say, give me the 20 largest pension funds in Africa, and then give me the portfolio construction of each of those pension funds, and show me how much of the portfolio construction of those pension funds is invested in venture capital and private equity, and then show me how much of that is invested in venture capital specifically, and then how much of that is invested in early stage venture, and watch the number that you're going to get. Watch the number that you're going to get, because what you're going to learn is this. In Africa, we love the idea that somebody's coming to save us. And so what a lot of the portfolio managers and asset allocators want is they want the return. They just don't want to take the risk. So in that early stage where there's a lot of the risk that's got to be picked up in each of those countries, a lot of them don't want to play in that space, and that's where the donor agencies are playing. So where are you going to find? Where is the Mastercard Foundation? Where are you going to find the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? Where are you going to find the IKEA Foundation? Where are you going to find the Ford Foundation? Where are you going to find them? You're going to find them allocating capital in that really, really early stage that catalyzes economic activity so that entrepreneurs can actually build businesses. That is an indictment on the asset allocators in Africa, because basically what we're saying is that our economic plan is that somebody else's foundation must come and invest in our risky assets and take the first loss risk. And once they've taken that first loss risk, we will then come on with all of this institutional capital, and then we're going to put the money in. Which country develops like that? Like nobody develops like that. You know, the Americans came up with a New Deal. I think it was Hoover's administration. They had the Marshall Plan for Europe. They invested their own assets themselves in themselves. Say whatever you want about the Chinese. The Chinese invested their own assets in China. They didn't wait for somebody else to go, we're going to give you aid. They said, just give us favorable trade terms. We will become the factory of the world. We will massively industrialize, and we will then massively achieve mechanizations and automations that you can't replicate at scale. So even if you have a textile industry in Mombasa, we will achieve the levels of scale that you cannot compete with us. Great. The Chinese planted Chinese capital to build China. The Russians planted Russian capital to build Russia. The Americans plant American capital to build the Americas. I was just in the Caribbean. I'm going to be in the Caribbean in 2 weeks' time because we're doing some fantastic stuff out there. I was just in Latin America. They invest their own capital in their own environments. Africans are sitting here watching the party and we're saying, please, Mr. White Man, please come and give me aid. This is the craziest thing to me, CD, and I don't get it. So the same leaders. Hold on, let me just wrap this up by saying it's like these same leaders, like, been in the game for forever. They've been in politics for forever. And it appears to me that they've run out of ideas. And the playbook is let somebody else develop the economy for us. Nobody, I can tell you now as somebody who does this for a living. If Citi comes to me and says, please invest in my business, the first question I'm asking Citi is how much of your own money have you invested in your business? Have you taken the bet on you first? And so I think African entrepreneurs who are early stage, startup founders, small business owners who say we don't have access to capital are telling the truth. The question they should be asking is, and why, dear government, don't we have access to capital? Because if the governments of those nations wanted to radically change that picture, they could.
So here's a question. I'm asking this question because this is a conversation I've actually brought up before. In fact, so I had a sit down with Zach. Zach,
Launch Africa.
Launch Africa, yes.
Solid and guy. I don't know if you know this, but Zach in person is actually taller than most people. Because I saw his picture, I always thought he was a short guy. Then I met him, I was like, okay, Zach he's like my height, and I'm tall, right? He's actually a tall guy.
Very tall guy. And by the way, Zach moved to South Africa, I think, after coming for the World Cup, and then he just loved it.
He's a former investment banker, former Wall Street guy.
Yeah. So I was having this almost similar conversation with him, and I asked him this question, which is the question is, the context of the question is, the situation we have right now with the capital allocators not investing or reinvesting in early stage, taking early stage risk on the continent as they should, is it a case of complacency, or is it a case of unwillingness, or is it a case of lack of education? So these are three different things. So complacency means that they have they have the knowledge, they understand the importance of it, but they are so comfortable with the already system of investment that they currently have. Maybe it's infrastructure. They know that if they build 10 houses here and there, whatever it is, maybe that's what they've been known to do. Maybe it's buying government bonds. So it's risk averse. They don't really want to care about anything else, despite having the knowledge. So they're just really comfortable with that. The unwillingness in the sense that is they can see the opportunity, they understand the mathematics, but they're just unwilling generally to actually take the first bite, which is why they're waiting for
Sure.
other people to come in, in their money first and see where it goes. You know, African, we have this thing, by the way, eating, not to digress, I have this thing, like, there will be some people who will be looking into, watching this podcast, and then they will say, let's see how far they go before we provide them with support. You know, African will have that.
Hey, listen. Hey,
Well,
listen. Hey, listen.
you have that. Let's say after maybe 5 episodes or 10 episodes, we'll see, right? So they have that nature. So is it that the case of the unwillingness case, is it that because it seems like venture is really new, early stage risk betting is also very new, they are really unwilling to just be like the first allocator of this capital? And then the third part is the lack of education, because VT, it will surprise you. And I think you already know this. It will surprise you the amount of people who are uneducated about the impact and the possibility of early stage betting in transforming economies that actually owns and control the resource within the continent that we're looking for, right?
Yeah.
It will surprise you. So so the question framing is like, in these three bases, which one do you think is the most influential factor why these people are not taking the early stage risk?
Yeah. Let me answer you this way, because I've given that a lot of thought and I've consulted with a lot, as you know, like my Rolodex is deep. And so I talk to a lot of people who are either in family offices or as, high net worth individuals or head of institutional capital, allocating capital on a daily, right? And so I can talk to this with some authority. There are three separate issues there. Let me start with the first one. The first one is that small business investment is not venture investment. Venture investment is not small business investment. Right. And so for anybody watching this, typically what happens when people are not in the industry or not in the know, they see these things as interchangeable. So they'll see somebody say, well, they've raised a venture fund, and they think, well, it's a small business fund. But venture is a very specific asset class that requires a very specific set of economics for the fund to actually work. It's a big part of the reason why we have become a permanent capital vehicle, because our thesis actually has been that specifically for the Africa environment, by the time you have generated the value in the underlying asset, typically in a fund structure, it's time to exit, because you construct a 5+2 or 10+1+1.
Yeah.
And so by the time you have generated the value, it's time to exit. And yet, actually, that's just at the beginning of that scale curve. And why am I mentioning that? Because you have to understand that genesis of venture capital. Venture capital as an asset class is started in the United States when they passed the SBDC, which was the Small Business Development Code. It was basically a tax code that allowed really, really wealthy people and families to invest money into small businesses, and for the money they would invest in small businesses, it would attract no tax. I think it was like capital gains tax and et cetera, et cetera. But so it was basically a tax-free savings, a tax-free investment program. So anybody who has, I don't know if you have, City, but if you've ever built, this is kind of what I spent a lot of my time doing. If you ever built a weighted average cost of capital calculation, that one of the most significant contributors to your cost of capital is taxation. And so if you're investing capital, or I'm raising capital and the capital doesn't attract tax, what happens is the cost of that capital goes down, which means that the return the capital has to generate, the hurdle rate, that the return the capital has to generate is now significantly lower than it would have been if I had the tax burden. Okay. Why am I mentioning this? What is the average tax rate in an African country? You tell me. Many of them are double digits. So what you've got here are governments whose fiscal program right, what they call fiscal space, often fairly constrained, they need that fiscus to be financing the economic activities. These governments don't know, or maybe somebody's not telling them, that the taxes they're generating from these like micro and small businesses is actually negligible relative to what they could generate if they said we're going to create an investment environment where it's tax exempt if you as an individual invest in a small business. Okay, it's actually tax exempt, the capital gains you're going to get, and then watch how many people would invest in those small businesses and how many of those small businesses would scale and grow, and then you can tax the businesses, right? So
Yep.
the point is you've got to tax at the right place in the system, right? But a lot of these governments don't do that because their fiscal program is already constrained. I mean, in a country like, and I'm not bashing. I love it. It's like my home. I travel there fairly often. I've got friends who live there. We've had clients there in the past. But in a country like Malawi, for instance, a big part of their fiscal program is the aid income that comes into the country. It's literally factored into the budget. The last time I checked, please don't lynch me if this is no longer the case. But the last time I checked, it's literally factored into the budget of how the Treasury Department runs that country, and they're not unique. It's the same in the I think in the Central African Republic. It's the same in Guinea. I think it's the same in Senegal. It's the same in many countries in the continent.
It's believe me, you don't even have to mention Malawi, right? You can come to my home, right?
Sierra
So
Leone.
yeah, so because you would see that aid received, by the way, whether it's aid, whether it's IMF loan, it's actually celebrated as a political win. And for me, it's like in my head,
It's
it,
it's
it,
crazy. So the point that I was making there was like, listen, small business finance and venture finance are not the same things, and I think it's important. That's a part of the reason why, given even how telling my program is, how telling your program is, I was like, listen, the things we know, the things we talk about, we actually need to educate people on this stuff. So
yeah.
there might be a policymaker somewhere out there, somebody working in Treasury or something like this, who'll watch this and go, let me go online and actually find out what are the difference between these. And you've got to regulate for them correctly. In South Africa, we had something many years ago called the Section 12J Act, and it was basically an act we had conceptualized but did not conceive a Section 12J investment vehicle. But basically, the idea was you take high net worth capital, you plant it into a tax-free instrument that would then invest into certain asset classes, and it wouldn't generate, and those investments wouldn't generate capital gains tax. It got abused by several people, which happens in capital systems. People abuse things, but when people abuse things, you don't stop them; you regulate for them. But of course, what happened in South Africa, I don't know why, is they decided to stop the program, and so we lost it. But at that time, there was significant portions of capital that flew into the Section 12J environment. Section 12J vehicles, some of them are still around now, but they're basically now operating as just these holding vehicles that are holding these assets because they were conceived at that time. But nobody's creating new Section 12J instruments because they can't. So that the first thing I wanted to say is small business and venture funding are very different things. The second thing I wanted to say to answer your point, you know what is the biggest enemy actually to capital flowing into small businesses, capital flowing into private assets, capital flowing into venture assets? It's actually bonds and real estate. So, I mean, I was in Zambia the other day, and again, love Zambia. There often, as you know, it's like home, like Zambia is like home to me now. But I don't quote me on this, but I think something like the bond rate on the 10-year, the yield on the 10-year bond in Zambia, I think is something like 18% or something like this. It's double digits, for sure, double digits. So let's think about that. A bond is a risk-free investment instrument. Yeah. Again, nobody come into the comment section and say, what do you mean risk-free? The government of Kenya defaulted or that government defaulted. I'm using classical liberal economics understanding, of course. Yeah. So a bond is a risk-free investment instrument, which often means that bankers in those economies price for the capital and the risk of that capital, and they will strike the beta at the bond rate. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what am I telling you? Simply what I'm telling you is, by the time you are raising capital for a small business or a venture business, or you're raising capital for a private equity kind of investment, you first have the illiquidity risk, because this thing is going to be difficult to exit when you want to exit, right? You don't have an over-the-counter trading instrument. So you're going to have the illiquidity risk. You've got the operator risk, right? You've got the execution risk, right? And that's set aside from the trade risk, the market risk, and all the other risks. And each of those risks gets layered onto the cost of the capital. Every unit of risk has a proportionate cost to that capital. So if I go to an environment like a Zambia, say, and I'm trying to raise a venture fund or something like this, and there are several that operate there, but you'll notice when you're going to have a look at their LPs that a lot of them actually their LPs are the same donor agencies we talk about. But when you go into that environment and you're trying to raise that kind of investment vehicle, what you begin to realize is that it's very difficult for those investment vehicles to show a risk-adjusted return that pays for the risk you're taking because of the return you generate from the bond rate. So, and it's the same for bonds, it's the same for real estate. One of the most expensive pieces of real estate in Africa is where? It's in Kampala, right? And so I've got one of my best friends lives in Kampala. He's done incredibly well, and he owns plots of real estate in Kampala. And he tells me all the time, like the returns he generates just on the market alone of the value of his assets as they accumulate because he's invested in Kampala. So if you are now going to raise a venture fund and invest in Kampala, you've got to compete with those returns, right? So the consequence of this is it's actually very difficult for Africans to make the case for a venture fund purely on the basis of financial return on DVIs and MOIs. We've actually got to be looking at other things, and I think that's important, which was the third point I wanted to make to you. And I think it's a little bit part, you mentioned it earlier. It's a little bit, I think, of what Zach is attempting to do at launch. It'll be interesting to see how the vintage of their current fund has performed. I think they're raising another fund now, but there are a number of players in the industry who are effectively saying we need to write and design what venture looks like for Africa. And so, is it 100 bets spread across $50,000 check sizes? Or is it 5 bets spread across, I don't know, $10 million check sizes or $5 million check sizes, right? At what stage? Is it early? Is it Series A? Is it like at what stage? What's the design? And the truth of it is that I think the jury is out on what the design looks like. I sent to you, you remember, the SAVCA report that looks at the South African ecosystem and how much capital has been allocated in the South African ecosystem, where the exits are. And did you see how many of the exits are loss-making? And how many of the funds that they reported on are actually funds that didn't generate the returns that they said they would generate? The number of zombie funds that's out there is crazy to me. But the point I wanted you to see when I sent you that report was that I think the largest, if not the second largest, capital in the ecosystem is actually CVC. Right. It's these captive funds that are corporate venture capital funds.
Yeah.
They're the ones actually that are driving a lot of the ecosystem and are driving a lot of the environment. So we are early, and I say all of this only to make the point that a big part of what I hope we get to achieve with this platform and this podcast is to get Africans talking about what should our model look like, what should our thesis look like, and specifically for our economies, which sectors should we be investing in? And most importantly, who should be taking the first loss risk? Like there is no Calvary. Nobody's coming to save us. At the end of the day, we have to be making those investments, right? And I think absent of people understanding that, it's going to be very difficult.
I was actually going to speak into that. So it's a good thing that you brought it back home. So every instrument that you've mentioned, makes sense. But this is just dedicated to one asset class that people allocators have been very fixated on. But there's a whole new asset class that is rising, which is the venture, the P, the backing of the early stage guys and all of those things. And here's why I think we should actually be taking those early bets is because today, when most of our politicians go on global stages, they talk the big talk. They talk about their AI strategy. They talk about, some of them. They talk about their climate strategy and things like that. But then there are allocators of capital, the pension funds and things like that, in-house, in-country, are not actually backing those statements, those political statements at global stages by backing early stage entrepreneurs. Because DT, no matter how much capital the donor fund comes in, the FDI comes in. Remember, again, another conversation I think we should be having is if exit happens, and when it does happen for some companies, it's actually a capital flight. It doesn't stay. So as much as you think, but the company ended up employing 100 people, okay, but who's actually benefiting the most? Like it's going back. So the capital is not actually staying into the country. And then here's another thing. The other thing is for most of this company, especially for those that actually end up getting the benefit, they are required for the sake of quote unquote investors risk management to HQ somewhere else. They
Else
domicile the company outside of their
of
country,
their own country. Yeah.
which again brings to the question, and this is a question that I've asked a friend of mine before, a good African, and I asked the question, and I'm going to ask this question to you. I have my opinion on this. How many African companies do we have in the continent that are unicorn companies? And this is, it seems like it's a direct question, but it really isn't. It really isn't, right? Because at the end of the day, when you look at the structural setup of these companies, the way they are set up to function is they have been domiciled outside of the continent. So
That's a
Africa,
good
by
point.
any chance, is an operative market, right? It's an operation. So Africa is an operations, but the HQ legally and from a position of setup because of their investor who, by the way, are not our own pension fund managers. They are not our own asset allocators. They are all foreign owners, whether through donors, whether through foundations, whatever structure that capital comes in with. It means that inherently, VT, by definition, how do you define the nationality of a country? And how do you, how do you define the nationality of a company?
Of a company. Yeah.
That do you define it by the market that they started from, or do you define it by their operational setup from a legal structure framework? Does it then become, does it become an African company that is a unicorn, but have all of its HQ in the UK and all of their investors invest through, by the way, for those of you who don't know, so when you domicile in let's say you're raising capital for your company and then you're domiciled somewhere in Delaware, when investors are making an investment, they're investing in the holding company in Delaware.
That's right.
So your Nigerian entity is just an operations market for them. So does that make you a Nigerian company? Really? I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
It's actually a very good point.
It's not black and white, but I would really like to just, dive into that, because I think the argument I'm trying to make is, instead of us domiciling our companies and talking about going back to our taxation systems and all of that, we have to also start realizing what some of the structures and their impacts really, really means.
Let me further inflame your question before I answer it, because the curse of Africa is that her economic construction has been extraction. So, the colonizers built ports, not because they wanted necessarily to develop those countries. It was because they wanted the infrastructure through which they could export whatever raw minerals they were extracting from those countries. There are stories told, and some I've seen, about how the road between the mine and the port is more developed than the road between the home and the schools. And that is because the people who were building the roads were trying to tell you something. We're not here to build schools or homes. We're here to take the stuff from underground, send it to our ports so that we can beneficiate it elsewhere, so we can come back into your country and sell it to you as finished products. That's the 20th century story of Africa's economies, these extractionist economies, right? You've just raised something which I'd never considered. If a fintech operating in, let's find an example, in Tanzania, is domiciled in Wyoming, raising capital from U.S. investors at a valuation on a U.S. basis, and its pathway to exit is going to be in the U.S., but its core business and its customer set is in Tanzania. Is that entity a Tanzanian entity, or is that entity a U.S. entity? I've got a friend of mine who actually does this for a job. He's a tax lawyer, and he's phenomenal at this. So we should get him as a guest on the podcast. You'll find him fascinating. I was with him in Oxford when I was out there. He talks about how tax is basically governments fighting over each other. Because the question is, when this Tanzanian entity has created value at a $400 million valuation and there is an exit, where is the flow of capital going to be? Is it in the operating entity in Tanzania, or is it going to be in the holding entity in Wyoming? And when it does, the waterfall of that capital, where is that waterfall going to go? And is it going to be reinvested back in Africa? The question you ask is important, and I'll tell you why. Because a big part of the thesis has been the return of these, young Africans in the diaspora who went to Kellogg and Chicago Booth and Harvard and Stanford, who've come back to build these entities in Africa. But to your point, when you actually have a look at the construction of their corporate structure, you realize that HQ, where the wealth sits, is actually in the country where they studied, not necessarily in the country where they are operating. And so set aside the social impact scores, set aside the work they do around driving inclusion, set aside the work they do around paying salaries and contributing to the tax base. But the bulk of the capital, which is in the value creation, you're legitimate in asking the question, where is that bulk of the capital? Is it in the country of origin or of operation, or is it in the country of where the holding structure sits? And let me tell you my answer to this. For a lot of the venture builders, full disclosure, we operate as a structure like this, right? So for a lot of the people who operate in this environment, however you frame that, business owners simply want to build in the place where building is the least difficult. That's it.
Yep.
Nobody wants to swim upstream. Nobody intelligent. You want to swim with the current, not against it. So you can't blame a Delaware, a Wyoming, a Mauritius, a Seychelles, a Singapore, a Dubai, the DIFC, Abu Dhabi, a Saudi. You can't blame these nations or these governments for doing what they did, which is here's what they figured out. That if we have a regulatory environment that incentivizes risk takers to base themselves here, they will base themselves here and they will operate over there. So the answer to your question is, what are the regulations of these environments? What's the regulation of these environments? What is the tax structure in these environments? Because the way for these governments actually to compete is to complain less about the fact that there is companies based somewhere else operating in their environment and focus their attention on creating a regulatory framework. Start with a sandbox. I said this now. When I was in the kingdom of Eswatini, I was invited there by some friends. We did a massive event, 3,000 people, all entrepreneurs. It was unbelievable city. It was probably one of the best events I've had this year. And of course, Eswatini is where my family comes from. We're fourth generation kind of. And the point is, I was saying to them, I was like, you guys have got to put in place an international financial center. And thankfully, we had in the room, the head of the central bank, and he was like, great idea. We should have a coffee about that. These governments uniquely have to think about creating a regulatory environment where international businesses find the incentive to domicile themselves in those countries. It's what Switzerland did. It's what Monaco did. It's a playbook. Get it right. And once you get that right, the second thing to get right. So the first thing to get right is you got to have the regulatory framework, because entrepreneurs will set up where the regulatory framework allows them to create the most amount of value with the least amount of hurdles. Simple. The second thing you've then got to get right is the capital pool. Entrepreneurs will base themselves where they can access capital at the most favorable terms at the cheapest price. So each of these environments I've spoken about first went after the regulatory part. Once they got that right, they then went after the capital pool part. So why are, these entities we're talking about, these African entities, basing themselves in Delaware or Wyoming or any of these places? It's actually simple. It's because of their proximity to capital, right? Because if the capital is coming from there and is protected by FINRA and the regulatory environment around FINRA and the SEC, and you're going to be investing that capital here, then there's necessary protections around what this capital is going to do, and you're going to get a dollar-based valuation. So I'm a lot more for complain less about the construction and construct the rules that help you to succeed. On my meeting now, the podcast I did just now with Anthony G, what a great guy, buddy. He runs a large financial services firm in South Africa called INM. It's such a cool guy. He said, the game comes down to figuring out what game do I play, what skills do I need to win that game, and what strategy do I need so that I can get the skills so that I can win the game. That's it. And that's basically where African governments and African leaders have got to ask themselves. It's like, uniquely, what are you doing that positions you to succeed? I wanted to ask you this question very quickly, and I'm cognizant about time. You operate in the venture studio space, which I have to say, I am just like, that's such a difficult game, man. Like, you've got people coming in, they have MVPs and then ideas, and they've got to build this thing. I'm like, oh man, this is way too much work for me. I'm just, bring me the business, bring me the financials. Let's have a look at evaluation, decide what we're doing and whether or not we're doing this thing. But fairly recently, we had this terrible news around what's been happening with Vusi. Shout out to my brother Moana Sitole, by the way. What a gem, man! Like, I've got all the time in the world for Bones. He's a good man. He's a believer, and I vividly remember when he started Founders Factory Africa, and one of my board members at the time, Saki came to me and he was like, Saki has this way of talking like me. He says, Vusi, I went to that launch. I said to him, yeah. He says, it was fantastic. You are in trouble. Because by the time Bongani and his partners created Founders Factory Africa, we, as the erstwhile firm now, my growth fund had already predated them by like 2 to 3 years. And as Saki was like, these guys are onto something. So I'm one of those people who I love to collaborate with people, not necessarily compete. And I was just like, Bongani is a good guy. And And I've seen the stuff that he was able to do with Founders Factory Africa, and then of course, migration over to the 54 VC. And one of the great things I think that they had in their thesis was this venture studio, which is a lot of the work that you do. And of course, they've had the rug pulled under them by MasterCard. I have two questions for you. First, where are you on this whole issue around 54 VC and MasterCard? And secondly, what should be happening to be building more venture studios out there? And why do we need these venture studios?
So it seems like an easy question, but I don't think it is. So firstly, again, I have massive respect for the 54 guys. I think the 54, obviously 54 Collective, actually, that's the name.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have massive respect for them. I think they are one of like the good guys that have actually been backing some really, really incredible companies in the continent. And what happened to them and what's happening, because I think it's still an ongoing matter, is it's quite stressful for everybody in the ecosystem. And I'll tell you why, because they were perhaps one of the only very few companies that were actually actively deploying capital as of last year in the ecosystem. So you should understand that there have been it's been really, really hard for a lot of early stage ventures. So seed and pre-Series A companies to actually raise capital. And they were one of the very few companies that were actually backing a lot of these entrepreneurs. And again, with support from MasterCard, right? Because MasterCard actually allows them to provide that. So there's still a lot of things that I don't think we know as a public to actually be able to pass judgment. And it's sad that when what happened to them and the whole news about MasterCard's withdrawing their funds and that the case in front of court, and everybody seemed to have an opinion on LinkedIn. And it was very troubling to actually see some of the opinions and some even respected people think they have, because nobody really knows what is going on. Because
100%.
at the face value, what we all know is MasterCard is getting close to $100 million in funding because of a change of a name, a rebrand. Like that, for me, doesn't seem like a good enough story. It simply doesn't look like a good enough story for all of that. So it must have been things happening in the background, like things that are factoring in the background that we perhaps don't know. But this is where I sit, looking at this from the outside, and also being very privileged to work with some people around this environment very closely, is that aid, no matter in what structure it comes in, comes with a lot of ego and a lot of politics.
Amen.
So it's not only the business of hitting KPIs, it's the business of agreeing to those terms and those ego stroking or striking that was not a representation in a written document that we call contract. And this is what we are used to saying, like the backroom conversation that happened before that contract was issued, right? So on the contract could look like there's a violation of XYZ, but then for you to first have $100 million, it means you must have beyond fantastic relationship with these people before you even get $100 million. I mean, BT, you've worked in the space, the people's game, right? There is no sort of business plan in this world, no sort of structure or strategy in this world that will make someone wake up and say, I'll give you $100 million, especially in this space. You have to have strong sponsor, strong people within that environment that are able to not only bet for you, but are able to also fight for you. So what happened with those relationships is something perhaps we can get, your guy to come on the podcast in the future to actually have this conversation. But the one thing that I know and I can speak on is that it absolutely doesn't make sense that this entire issue was just because of a rebrand. Because if you're looking from an impact perspective, 54 Collective, previously Founders Factory, have gone to back some really insanely great entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah, their portfolio construction is solid.
African entrepreneurs. So it's very important that I also establish that, because as much as we have some really fantastic entrepreneurs in the continent that have, raised capital, that are doing some really, really great job in the continent, we must recognize what that actually means. So before now, almost 80 to 90% of all capital raised in the continent, we are raised by founders in the continent who have either studied overseas, live overseas, grew overseas, or who are
Or
Europeans.
just say it. Thank you.
Who are
Thank you.
Europeans or Americans that have come to the continent and and then they are building in the continent. Now, nothing to take away from these guys. Some of them are friends of mine. Some of them are really, really great. But
Indeed, yeah,
what
solid
54
guys, some
Collective
of
have
them.
done is to actually be able to back. So I think 54 Collective and Launch Africa are perhaps like the two very outstanding backers of entrepreneurs that have actually backed indigenous African founders in the continent at scale, especially at that early stage, right? And
Yeah.
so this what is happening now presents it's going to be a very unique business case, but it's not only a business case, it's the politics of doing business in an environment wherein you don't have all of the power, all of the leverage. And
Yeah.
I think
I
it's
mean,
very important to actually note to actually
underscore that. Yeah. Yeah. Before you answer your second question, let me say that I think you and I were having this conversation offline actually a few weeks ago when the news broke, and I was like, there's something in it for me that just doesn't make sense, right? So I think that it was $110 million or something like this that was allocated or
yeah.
committed to that fund. And let's imagine that they're running a 220 model, but it being early stage, it's probably, 2.5 to 30. So let's imagine they're running a 220 model and they're charging 2% management fee on capital. You would then say, if let's just take that everything in the public is true, or what has been published thus far by Tekabao et al. Is true, and they have, there were funds that were spent on a rebrand, I think, which numbers in the region of a
Like
couple of hundred
600K
thousand
or so.
dollars. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Well, so the question I would ask is, right, so the question I would ask is, what was their management fee? And surely, if this was an issue of, misallocation of capital, the first thing that you would do is you would slap them on the wrist and say, don't do that again. The second thing you would do is say, what kind of guardrails do we need to put in place to prevent this from happening? So where are we allocating the capital? Who has the approvals? What structures do you have in place from a governance framework to make sure
Yep.
that before you draw down this capital and allocate it into operation expenses, it actually does the things that it's supposed to do? And I don't know if this did happen. I'm just saying, this is my mind. My mind is logically like this should happen. But the third thing you would say is you would say to them, well, the amount of money we're going to pay you in your management fee is actually more than the money that we say you misappropriated. So what we're going to do is we're just going to deduct it from your man fee, right? And I say that with as much grace as possible to both the people at MasterCard as well as 54 VC. But I say that only to make the point that, like, this ecosystem is just way too early and way too volatile for this kind of stuff to be happening. Like, this industry, people have to figure out a way to resolve their differences through conversation, mediation, and arbitration where necessary without going litigious, and certainly without it blowing up in the media. Because when it does blow up in the media, it's not just the parties involved that are affected, it's the
Everybody.
image of everybody, right, that gets affected by this. Now, yeah, unless you're operating in, kind of, late stage private equity. This is why I said to you, I was just like, this venture thing for us, we're going to do a PCD for everybody in the ecosystem. It's just not great news. And again, I think, shout out to the people at 4VC for answering the call, building something of value. There are a lot of people who say they are Pan-African. Those guys actually were Pan-African. Like, they actually
Oh,
had a venture studio in Nairobi. Often Bongani and I would catch each other on flights. Like, he'd be like sitting a row behind me and I'm like a row ahead of him, in front of him, or something like this on the flight, either to Nairobi or back. So a lot of the work that they were doing, I'm just like, these guys were onto something. And I just felt, I must be honest, I was a bit sad, man. I was just like, but guys, there surely could have been another way to resolve this. Now, in time, it'll probably come out in the wash exactly what the issues are and what the personalities are. But I do want to say this very, very, very quickly. I think, and I'm not sure, but I think that MasterCard is also involved in a litigation or something like this with another partner of theirs in Uganda or something like this. I speak under correction. And the only thing I would say is this is a time game, not a money game. So we are way too early and the ecosystem is way too volatile and the business case is not yet made, forget venture in Africa, for venture general. right? At scale. A lot of these, what they now call multi-strategy funds are having similar issues. So I'm just like, guys, can we just sit around the table and find a way to mediate around this stuff so that we're not reading about each other in the press because there's so much good stuff to do. Speaking of the good stuff to do, I have to tell you, I'm going to brag a little bit now. So I invited E over to my place. He was in South Africa, I want to say circa 2020 or 2021, and he was in South Africa. And I was like, hey, dude, come over to my place. And I invited him over to my place. At the time, I was living at the Gulf Estate, very nice Gulf Estate, and I invited him over to my place, and I took him to the clubhouse. And whilst we were there, he was telling me that he was working on this concept to build a Silicon Valley in Nigeria, and they were started to work on this, and they were going to be breaking ground. Well, lo and behold, you sent me the link the other day, and they've like broken ground. They're building this thing, and I think they're creating now the regulatory framework to allow for something like this to happen. And for me, that's the stuff that I want our press and our media to be about. Sure, we can fight and we can have our differences, but I think the press that we should be having is like, I just said to you now, what do we need to do to make sure we domicile more deals in Africa? You need a regulatory framework that enables for that to happen, that creates the financial as well as IP incentives, because a big part of the problem is the IP ownership in our continent. And then the second part is you need the capital pool. And I think some of the work that Ian and his team are attempting to do is around creating that environment. So all of that to say, like, it's sad that the story that we spoke about 2 minutes ago has kind of ended up and played out the way that it's played out. I don't think it's a win for the ecosystem. I don't think it's a win for the ecosystem. I think I can imagine the levels of anxiety for a number of the startup founders who are in the portfolios who would have had drag or tag along clauses in those contracts when are looking
Yeah.
at going, so what am I going to do about my next capital raise? Where's the capital going to come from? What does this mean for my runway? What does it mean for my business plan? And it's just sad that it's played out like this. But best wishes to everybody involved, because
Yeah.
certainly we need that situation resolved and quickly.
Because it's a very big decision, right? So that it's not $50,000. It's not $100,000. This is tens of millions of dollars, but it's also impacting, like you mentioned, it's impacting hundreds of entrepreneurs that have gone through that pipeline, that have deal structure, that have different, that perhaps in limbo now, trying to figure out what happened next. Like, where do they go from? I know of an entrepreneur personally who was expecting a fund from 54 Collective, and then this happened, right? And in fact, his story is so sad that this doesn't only happen. His CTO left and took a job in somewhere in India, and so,
Yeah.
but yeah, and so now he has to rebuild. It's pretty sad, and it's also very, very heartbreaking. And I think this is one of the things that you and I have been speaking about, is that at what level do we balance truth speaking, accountability, and ownership, and also be able to have these conversations with folks and friends, allowing people to be able to solve issues
Speak in
without
minds. Yeah.
without actually
Yeah.
going home.
This will be, and maybe that's a good, place for us to close it for this segment. But for me, this has been a part of what I struggle with, right? Is this industry is notoriously, it's very small. First of all, very, very small. In most industries, you're 3 or 4 degrees of separation away from knowing somebody. This industry is so nascent that you're maybe a degree away from somebody who knows somebody. So there's always somebody in the room who knows something about somebody. And that's the first thing to say. And the second thing to say, and I say this with love and respect, but I think a lot of our colleagues in this industry are also very thin-skinned, especially people who are in positions of power. For sure, the guys who are LPs or allocators for institutional capital, they don't like criticism. They don't like criticism at all. And so what you typically tend to find is that of the opinions and views that the operators in this environment have, they dare share those opinions and views because they don't want to be sidelined. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah.
Hey, family. I just wanted to say thank you to the 1.7 million of you who are returning viewers on our channel. When the team shared that with me, I swear, I almost fell off my chair. I was like, 1.7 million people who return to watch the content on the channel. That's just unbelievable. I'm so humbled that you find the content we share valuable. And I promise we're going to do the best we can to keep bringing you content of value. I do have an ask, though. 66.4% of you that watch the channel have yet to subscribe. You know what would really, really, really help me? I've got a running bet with the team, and we want to see if we can get that to below 60%. I need a favor. I need you to scroll down the video. You're going to see that bell icon, and I need you to press it because then you're going to subscribe and you're going to help me meet my metric. We have some exciting guests we've got planned for you, some incredible guests we've already shot. You would have met Kasim for our first Ideas That Matter Plus video format of the content podcast, and it's already gone viral. We literally hit 30,000 views within the first day of posting it. No advertising, no marketing. We just put up a link. And I said to the team, I think we're onto something here. One of the things I'm very passionate about is making sure we leave the world better than we found it, and that we leave our community better than we found them. So hit the subscribe button, and I look forward to sharing more content with you, more insights, more motivation, and just generally helping the world become a better place using this medium. All right, family. We'll talk soon. Cheers.
No, absolutely. Again, I think this is a matter of leverage, right? And once we're able to establish that leverage and who holds what, then I think, but it's a given. It's a given, BT. There's no way, and allow me to allow me to just take one tiny jab here. There's no way for us to actually solve a problem without really understanding the problem. I mean, you and I had a quick chat on the high unemployment rate in South Africa, which is, by the way, perhaps the most accurately measured one compared to other African countries. And you and I actually
Exactly.
have a vision of, if South Africa has such a high rate of unemployment, 60 plus percentage, right?
For
And
youth, yeah.
it's properly and accurately measure. Can you imagine what is happening in other African ecosystem, other African
Yeah, yeah.
countries? And so, unless we get to a position where we are able to face the bitter truth without malice, which is very important in this situation, without malice, and be able to understand that what we call criticism is not necessarily, it's not every day it's coming from an ill-fated heart. Sometimes it's understanding that you are, the function of the things that you're doing are actually creating environment that are killing other people. And you need someone to be able to point you to that truth and be able to look outside of it. Because as leaders, every leader has a blind spot. They are called blind spots because you don't see it. It takes other people to say,
To see it
hey,
for you.
to see it for you. The question is, would you be willing to listen? And that's the only way we're actually going to be able to build the ecosystem. And to wrap up, VT, I'll always say
Sorry,
this. So,
can I just say, before you say to wrap up, let me just say very quickly to support what you just said, to buttress you. The biggest growth I have had as a leader has been growth that's been based on feedback. And so, if you if you if you are you have a job, which job in its execution necessarily has an impact on society or other people's lives, you must expect that you're going to get feedback, right? So, when we say there is an issue with how capital is allocated, when we say there is an issue with how some of the aid or donor agencies are presenting conditions precedent on deals that they want to participate in, on how they're behaving as LPs in the ecosystem, we're not saying don't do it. What we're saying is, let's have a two-way conversation so that we, on the end of, the builders on your end, allocators on my end, and it's like, can we at least understand each other and the push and pull factors that are required to work? Because absent of understanding each other, all you're going to get is these asset. I heard this LP say this in London the other day. He said to me, it's these asset machines. I said, what are these asset machines? He said it's basically venture or private equity firms, but he was talking specifically about venture, whose business case is around accumulating assets so that they can charge management fee, but isn't actually around getting to the point of hitting their hurdle rates and getting the carried interests. And so their whole business case is get as big as possible so that you can earn as much man fees as possible, rather than, off the sweat of your, demonstrate that you can actually build a defendable business moat. And in that moat that you can generate superior returns that is, either top quartile or top decile in your industry. And if you can't do that, then you shouldn't have a right to exist. And he was basically saying, like, that's the conversation we need to be having. So I'm hoping what we get to do with this platform is to bring ecosystem players, builders, venture allocators, high net worth individuals, et cetera, who understand what's out there, what needs to happen, and what is the best way for us to do the thing that is out there. The number of entrepreneurs I have worked with, met with, some that I've backed, who have left, the continent and gone to other parts of the world, and in a third of the time have built multiples the value they would have built if they were here, is heartbreaking to me, because I see a lot of those as like an opportunity cost. And so I just genuinely am like, guys, can we just get on the same page and figure out a playbook for this thing? Because absent of the playbook, we're going to have a problem.
No, absolutely. It's no fault of theirs. I think we touched on this earlier on, right? So they are going to go where they can maximize their potential in the best way possible, right? And it's almost hypocritical for us. I sit in the UK, you are in SA, but I have global access. To ask another entrepreneur, another very brilliant mind who is somewhere in Sierra Leone to say, "Oh no, stay in Sierra Leone, just build there and don't take the opportunity to go see the world or things like that." Like, it's almost unthinkable for you to actually do that. And the reason for that is because our leaders have not intentionally built the framework to actually maximize the potential of the so-called competitive advantage that we have, that is its young people.
The youth. Yeah.
We always quote these in all of the conversation that we have. We make the quote about how agile our youth population is, how fast it is growing. But without the system and the framework to maximize their full potential, we're just going to be left as an overpopulated continent that doesn't have any competitive advantage, real competitive advantage to offer at the global scale.
Recommendation for everybody: go and watch I think it's a keynote delivered by Fred Swanica. What a guy! ALA, ALX, SAN Technologies in Iran. Solid guy. Hey, Fred, shout out to you. Keep doing the work that you're doing. We see you, brother, and we support you. Yeah, in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send him the link on this on WhatsApp. But there was a keynote that he delivered a contra call where, and he was saying, everybody talks about this Africa, this talent, but he was like, you don't have a talent issue. You've actually got a burden. It's like he didn't call it a burden. He called it something else. But it's like this idea that there's a demographic dividend. He was like, you've actually got a problem incoming, because just because a population exists doesn't mean that population is talent. There is actually a process you've got to follow to convert people who are latent potential into talent. And a lot of that is around skilling. It's around education. It's around creating the environment so that the population is a talent base, because a talent base is an asset from which the economy can extract value. So that's it from me, man. Thank you for this conversation.
Yes. And thank you everyone who have tuned in, listening to us. Again, as we say, this is a conversation that Vusi and I normally have. So you'll probably not be having the opportunity to listen to a conversation like this. Very authentic, very real, and coming from a position of not only knowledge, but also lived experiences. So why don't you join me with us? Share, subscribe, like. I don't know what you what you should do. But until next time, I've been your humbly Sidi Sako, and I've been joined by the awesome and the great, amazing co-host